Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Intro to Oral History webinar from the DC Oral History Collaborative. Just as a reminder, please mute yourselves when you're not speaking, just so that we make sure that we minimize as much feedback as possible so that everyone can hear. So we'll be talking today about oral history. This is designed to be a general, very broad overview of what's involved in oral history so that everyone can be aware of what the process looks like before you get involved, before you get into more of what oral history is involved. I'm Anna Kaplan. I will be leading this webinar. I created it with my colleague Maggie Lemire, and we've been working with the DC Oral History Collaborative for the past 5 years. So just a little overview of what I'll be covering this evening. First, I'll give you a quick introduction to the DC Oral History Collaborative. Then we'll talk through what is oral history, and we'll go through project planning, conducting an interview, and then post-interview processing and preservation. And then I'll share a couple examples of ways to use oral history, and I'll also share some additional resources with you at the end. We'll have some Q&A time at the very end of today's session, but I'll also stop periodically throughout so that if anyone has any questions about that little chunk of the presentation, feel free to answer it then. Also, feel free to share any sort of experience or knowledge or resources that you might want to share with others in the chat as well. This is, a great way to sort of learn all together and build off each other as resources, not just me as the person speaking to you here. So, what is the DC Oral History Collaborative? It is an initiative that was started by Humanities DC, the Historical Society of Washington, DC, and DC Public Library. It is currently a partnership between Humanities DC and the DC Public Library, and the effort is to document and preserve stories and memories of DC residents as a lot of communities experience change and as residents age. So the purpose is to increase awareness of existing oral history recordings through surveys of oral histories that already exist and are hopefully available to the public. It also gives residents some training for free on how to do oral history, and also financial resources through grants or community partnerships that are necessary in order to do some really stellar interviewing and creating projects that are very meaningful and show and create little windows into different communities and experiences that people have in DC and in the DC area. So as I said before, I'm Anna Kaplan, and Maggie Lemire helped me create this webinar. We've been teaching trainings for the DC Oral History Collaborative for several years now, and this is one of our newer iterations of it. So a little bit about me. I have a PhD in history from American University, and I studied particularly African-American history in the US, in modern US, looking at how people tell stories about the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, and how that shapes the way that people understand those historical events and contextualize what's happening today based on those narratives told about the past. I also have a master's in oral history from Columbia University. And before that, I studied anthropology and folklore. So I bring sort of an interdisciplinary approach to oral history and studying history in general. And of course, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, writing what your name is and an aspect of DC history or an aspect of oral history that is interesting to you. This is a great way to sort of introduce yourself to other people who are here and make it feel a little bit less like a bunch of random people you may not know here in the webinar. So first, what is oral history? And when I think about what oral history is, I like to start way back, thinking about oral history as a cultural tradition, not just a methodology that has been developed in collaboration with archives. It's something that is part of a lot of traditions for different communities and for different cultures. So this quote by Napitia Mahuika is a really great quote. He brings a perspective from a Maori tribe from New Zealand, and his definition of oral history from an Indigenous perspective is, quote, "For many Indigenous communities, oral history is inextricably connected to identity. It is a collective enterprise essential to cultural survival, naming the world, asserting power and belonging, and narrating relationships across time and space to land, sea, sky, and each other." And this comes from his book, Rethinking Oral History and Tradition. And that's just a really powerful way to remind us that oral history is rooted in this long history of human communities, of people and their communities and their cultures sharing knowledge, sharing understanding, making meaning in the world around them. And this is something that is very much borrowed from and built on with the oral history that the DC Oral History Collaborative teaches. So what is oral history? The DC Oral History Collaborative approaches oral history as a recorded, spoken, or signed interview that centers the narrator's perspectives, experiences, agency, and authority from the project design and recorded conversation all the way through preservation and possible uses of the interview. So this is sort of an all-encompassing approach. It builds off of the history of the Federal Writers Project and recording slave narratives in the 1930s through the present to oral history and this large field that's developing and academic programs that are using and teaching oral history as well. So the Oral History Association, which is a professional association for oral history, it's located in the United States, but it incorporates members from all across the world. Their definition of oral history is that it is both the interview process and the products that result from a recorded, spoken, or signed interview, whether that is audio, video, or other formats. So it's a little bit flexible in terms of what oral history is. It can be an audio recording, it can be a video recording. Sometimes people get really creative and approach oral history recording in different ways. But it's also both the interview process itself and the recording, the interview that is captured as a result from a recorded or spoken, a recorded, signed, or spoken interview. It helps people place their experiences within a larger social and historical context. Because in the process of this discussion, it's not just focusing on individual people's experiences, but relating them to what's going on in the world and figuring out sort of what the influences are, how people are negotiating what's happening around them as they are moving through their life. It also captures recollections about the past, but particularly filtered through the lens of a changing personal and social context. So they are memories, but they are articulated and understood through the current moment. And that really shapes how people talk about and understand their past experiences. It's also a dynamic collaborative relationship between the interviewer and the narrator or the interviewee. And this is really important. Oral history isn't just a person sitting in a room by themselves dictating their memoir into an audio recorder. It's not someone sitting there typing or writing out their memoir. It's really a conversation between two people who are both shaping this oral history together, that it's very much shaped by the stories the narrator tells, the questions that the interviewer asks and prompts the narrator to tell some of these stories, and then also the ways that narrators push back and say, maybe I'm not answering that question, or maybe the question you asked isn't really the approach that I want to take to discussing this topic. And so it's this really interesting give and take, this push and pull between the interviewer and the narrator that creates a dynamic and interesting conversation recorded as an oral history. And there are a few goals that oral history as a process are trying to capture. So the first is trust, having to build trust in this relationship so that the narrator feels like they can share what they need to share or what they want to share, that the interviewer can ask questions about really difficult topics, and the narrator is comfortable responding to those questions and telling their stories. And this allows for vulnerability from both sides of, opening up and sharing some of yourself in order to get sharing from the other person in return. This also includes deep listening. So really listening to what the narrator is saying, not just reading off a list of questions that you wrote beforehand, but really being present in the moment, listening to the stories they're telling, trying to figure out maybe what they're not saying that you need to ask them and prompt them to say. Thinking about some of the words that they're using, and ask them about why they choose to use those words or what those words mean within the context of those experiences. It's also asking for stories. So getting those rich details of what people are feeling, what they're seeing, what they're smelling, describing places, describing people, describing events, really bringing some of this past and these memories to life in a way that's very exciting for you as the interviewer, but also for people later who will be listening to the interview. Also getting some reflection, so some analysis, some meaning making of having narrators think back on their life, of drawing connections between different parts of their life that maybe they haven't drawn connections between before. Of really thinking about the impact that they've made in their communities or on the world, and sharing some of their wisdom, some of the things that they've learned, taking that whole picture point of view and not just the granular individual stories and experiences. So oral history can be used for many purposes. There is a certain amount of power in oral history in the fact that it captures and uplifts voices, that it can add perspectives to the archive, to the written record. It can challenge the written record as well. It can challenge the information that's in an archive. And so really thinking about, how do we want to use oral history? What is our purpose behind oral history? And for me, it's really about capturing these underrepresented stories and perspectives, of adding new information to the record, of challenging some of these old and exhausted narratives about the past. It's about working with communities that you are a part of or have a deep relationship to. And that's really important in order to build trust and get that vulnerability that we were talking about before. It's also focusing on ordinary people. So really seeing how ordinary people can shape and make history. It's not just people in power, it's not just famous people, but everyday people are extraordinary in their everyday lives. So does anyone have any questions right now? Just scrolling through the chat just to make sure. Okay, so I'll keep moving on. And if any questions come up, then please feel free to put them in the chat. And I'll make sure that I address them. So next is planning an oral history project. What's involved in that? So the first thing that you need to do is to really articulate and clarify what you want to document in your project. So whose story do you want to tell? And particularly, whose story do you uniquely have access to? What's available to you? Who is available to you? You may think that you want to interview Virginia Ali, one of the founders of Ben's Chili Bowl. But if you can't get in contact with her, then how can you do that interview? If you can't create that relationship of trust and vulnerability, then is that interview worth doing, or should you be interviewing someone else? Think about what questions you have about the story. What are the issues you want to delve into? What are the themes that you want to bring to the front? Why is telling this story important? What is this going to add to the record? It would be great if we could capture everyone's stories, but we can't. We have limited resources, limited time. And so we really need to think about whose stories are we sharing? Whose stories are we documenting? Are we spending this little bit of extra time on them? And why are they important? And being able to write that down, being able to really clarify and say that for yourself of why this person is important and their story is important is really key for also asking them to share that story with you, and showing that you know how valuable their story is. Also thinking about what you plan to do with the stories or interviews afterwards. So having this long-term plan or vision, and it can change, but it helps the narrator have a bit of an idea of what the importance of sharing their story is, or what's going to happen with it after the interview. And of course, building a team and deciding roles or responsibilities is a central part of this. So some of the roles may be project leaders, interviewers, transcribers, researchers, community liaisons, and outreach or feedback partners. And it's really important to think about who is in each of these roles and how that might have an impact on the project as well. So thinking about who has a seat at the table in making decisions about your project, and maybe whose voices are left out. Thinking about, is this a problem? Is this an issue? If it is, how might we address that? It's a great way to build in community buy-in for your project if they have some of these positions in the team, if they have a seat at the table and are able to help shape and make decisions about the project. And of course, creating a budget. So thinking about recording technology, transportation, parts of doing the interview, like transcribing, any gifts or honorariums, or if there needs to be thought about, do we need to compensate their travel costs? Do we need to compensate them arranging for care for someone in their families? Also thinking about hard drives or online storage to hold these interviews. A lot of time, of course, doing the interview takes time. Also creating interpretations afterward. Do you need a budget for that? Maybe also budgeting for an oral history consultant on your project. So thinking about these different pieces that make up a really robust oral history project. And of course, part of preparing for an oral history interview and creating an oral history project is thinking about ongoing consent. And a lot of times that involves a legal release form. So part of what makes oral history different from a lot of other fields is that it is a practice of continued and ongoing consent. So this is consent for the interview to happen, and usually that is agreeing to the interview and scheduling the interview. It's also recording the interview, so getting their consent right before you start the recording or right as you're starting the recording. It's getting consent to archive the interview and or making that public. And usually that's where the legal release form comes in. It's also getting consent for using the oral history in different ways after it's been recorded. So really at the heart of oral history is making sure that we respect the narrator's agency and that we retain their ability to control their story and have a say over their story and how it gets used, no matter what, because it's their story. We don't want to take that away from them. So every archive usually has its own release form that it requires the narrator to sign in order to accept it into their archive. And usually this includes information like their name, their contact information. None of that will be shared with the public, but it's just in case the archive needs to get in touch with them. A project description, confirmed and potential uses of the interview. That includes any restrictions that the narrator may place on how the interview can be used, how people can access it, if there's a time restriction that has to wait until it's made public, statements about who owns copyright, and that can help the archive really care for the interview long-term and make copies in order to update the technology that it's recorded on. And of course, signatures. So confirming that the narrator gives consent, that they know what they're agreeing to. And it's important to have this ahead of time and to talk about it with narrators ahead of time, but not have them sign it until after the interview. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. Let me pause a little bit. Does anyone have any questions so far?
Anna, it looks like we have some questions in the chat.
Okay.
It starts with Mallory Miller.
Just reading through this question. So it's, I'm working on a project where we are partnering with the Humanities Truck to gather oral histories of union labor and working class folks in DC. Double thumbs up for Humanities Truck. They are a great organization. We are gathering people at an event and some community engaging activities since the interviewees are not known to us until they arrive. Is there anything you recommend considering? So definitely I would talk to the staff for Humanities Truck about this because they have a lot of experience with this. They've been doing it for a couple years. But I would definitely think ahead about sort of the context of the place and thinking about, these are going to be interviews that are taking place in the public. And so narrators may not feel as comfortable being quite as open and honest about certain topics, especially difficult topics, as they would if it were in a very private setting. So thinking about how this might be maybe a pre-interview or a beginning interview, and then maybe you can follow up with them later in a more private setting if there are issues that you want to dig into more. But really thinking about like what is their comfort, what is the time period, or like the length that you'll be able to give to each person for an interview. How long do they have to sit there and to talk to you? Just thinking about sort of how that dynamic, it's a very particular dynamic, and it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. It just means that it'll shape the results that you get from that experience. And then the follow-up was, should we consider inviting specific people to help find all that we gather? Again, that's up to you. It depends on, again, sort of how you want to build out this project. what perspectives you want to get. And again, thinking about sort of the more public nature of the humanities truck, as opposed to an interview done in someone's home or their office, or even at a DC Public Library branch where there's a room that you can go to. Just thinking about how that dynamic might shape the interview and the stories that you get. And then there's another question asking, oh, this isn't a question, it's just a remark. Thank you, Daniel. Yes, oral history is absolutely a way of slowing down and recognizing people's wisdom. That absolutely, oral history is not all about the quick quote or the perfect little 2-minute story. It's about that long conversation. So thinking about those long conversations that you have with your grandmother on the phone, or the long after dinner storytelling at a Thanksgiving dinner, or something like that. Like that's the spirit of oral history, of really sitting back and allowing this time, creating an atmosphere for the narrator to tell their stories the way that they want to tell them, and to really listen and get engaged and be present in that moment with them. So how do you prepare for an oral history interview? How do you prepare for creating those moments, making sure you have enough to ask them, making sure that your technology is there? There's a lot involved. So the first part is inviting the person to do the oral history interview with you. So this includes explaining what oral history is, how long the interview may take, whether or not you're going to do multiple sessions, what the process is, what they can expect even after the interview is done, and what the plan for preservation or for using oral histories are. So a lot of this, again, goes back to thinking about what your objectives are or purpose is for doing this interview or doing this project. So again, being able to say to the person that their story is really valuable, that they have a perspective that no one else has, and that you want to talk to them about it. Oftentimes people will say, oh, but I have nothing to say about that, or you don't want to talk to me really. And you need to be prepared to come back to them and say, no, I actually do want to talk to you. You're very important. Another important part is choosing recording technology. So just for your awareness, archival quality digital audio recordings are a broadcast WAV file format, and that's for audio, with a sample rate of at least 48 kilohertz and a bit depth of at least 16 bits, maybe 24 bits. And that can sound like a whole bunch of mumbo jumbo. But this is what you want to look for when you are getting a recorder or using a recorder. It should say on the box or in the manual that what file format it records in, and the different settings that you can use to get these recordings. This should not scare you away. If you're not able to get a recorder that records at this standard, that's okay. A lot of archives, most archives, will accept an exceptionally good oral history, even if the file itself is not up to top archival quality standards. So don't let this scare you away. It's just something to think about when you're considering what kind of technology to use for your interviewing. So some more questions to think about when you're choosing your technology. Is it accessible to both you and your narrator? Do you know how to operate it? Can you afford it? Does it require, especially if it's for virtual recording, does it require using a computer, or can it work with an iPad or a smartphone? That's especially important depending on what technology the narrator has access to. So maybe you have a computer that can support this platform, but does the narrator have one on their end that they can use? Can it record a high quality file, an audio file and or a video file? It depends on whatever your needs are for the recording later, but that's something to think about. What is the power source, and will it last the entire interview? It's no good if your power source, if you only have batteries that last 30 minutes, but the interview is supposed to be 2 hours long. Also, does the technology, does the session provide a secure and private session if needed? So if the narrator is going to talk about maybe their documentation status, their immigration status, their experience with the justice system, the criminal justice system, then maybe they want to make sure that no one will be Zoom bombing the session, or that no one can walk into the room accidentally. But on the other hand, maybe the narrator doesn't mind. Maybe they are fine with whatever the settings are. Maybe they're fine with being just in a room with a closed door in the DC Public Library. This is about having a conversation with the narrator, figuring out what they need in order to make them comfortable, and then making sure that you can deliver what you're promising and not over promising something that you can't provide. And that includes the technology too, especially if you're doing remote or virtual interviews. Also, can you transfer the file after the interview? If you're recording on your phone, make sure you know how to get it off of your phone. If the file saves to the cloud, make sure you're able to access that from the cloud later and save it in multiple places. Again, it doesn't do any good if you can't transfer the file afterward and use it. So another part of preparing for the interview is research. And this is researching the person who you're going to interview as much as possible. There may not be a bunch of information on them because ideally these are ordinary people, everyday people. There may not be a ton of information, but you can research the communities around them. You can research the neighborhoods that they're in, some of the places that they've been involved in, events they've been involved in, some of the historical themes or experiences. So doing some research on, some of their identities of, if they're an African-American woman who grew up in the 1950s in Washington, DC, you can read some books about how other people have talked about their experiences as African-American women in the 1950s or African-American women in DC in the 1950s. And that'll give you an idea of some of the things that you might listen for. So if they just mention, some of the theaters, or if they mention some places on U Street that they went to, or they mention public transportation and just drop little hints about things that you'll be able to recognize them, pick up on them, and ask them more questions about that in order to get some really rich stories from them. You'll also want to create an interview guide, and I'll show you an example in just a minute, but this is a written document where you can state your objective for the interview, give a paragraph or some bullet points of background information on the person and on what information you're looking for, why you're doing this, and then write out possible questions and group them by themes, but also organize it by the possible flow that the interview will take so that it's organized and you have sort of clusters of questions that you can ask rather than having them scattered everywhere. And when you're in the middle of the interview, you're trying to remember which question leads to the next one. An important thing is that when you're helping the narrator prepare for the interview, you do not want to send them the actual questions that you've written up because you don't want them to get attached to those questions. You want it to just be a conversation, and whether or not you ask the questions that you prepared is up to you, not up to the narrator. But you can definitely share the themes that you've come up with the narrator so that they feel comfortable about what you're going to talk about, knowing what they might share, to start thinking of stories ahead of time, So definitely share themes, but not the questions themselves. And this is an example of an interview guide. I'm not expecting you to read all of this, but it's just an example. This one's almost 3 pages of questions. And you can see that the questions are grouped into little paragraphs, and these are based around some themes. And so for this particular interview, it's about an immigration or migration story for a Korean restaurant owner. And so it begins with their life coming to the United States, their life in Seoul, South Korea, before coming to the United States, then what it was like to come to the United States, starting a new life here and in different states, and then eventually what led to them opening up a restaurant. So you can see that there are themes, and that the themes are in the order of how they think the flow of the interview might go. And so when you get to the interview itself, you want to start out by recording a lead. And this is, you press the record button and then you say your name. I always have the narrator say their own name, so it's on the record of how they pronounce their name. Say the names of anyone else who might be in the room. For example, if they have a caretaker with them, just saying who else is in the room so that people listening to the recording later get an idea of what the atmosphere is like. Saying the date, the location, and the purpose of the interview. And that's helpful for anyone listening later. They know the context of the interview, particularly if the recording gets separated from any sort of written documents. And then always ask verbal permission to record the interview. And again, this is part of the consent process. Then you just be curious. You spend your time asking open-ended questions, asking them for descriptions and stories and examples, really bringing out some of that rich history and memory, some of their experiences that they want to share. Also, don't assume or skip over knowledge that you might have that's similar to the narrator's knowledge. Think, have in the back of your head that other people who may not be familiar with that place or those people might be listening to this. And so they might not understand when someone references Kramer's bookstore. They don't know what that is, or they don't know the significance of that bookstore within the neighborhood. And so asking the narrator to explain it. It's also helpful to have narrators explain things in their own words. So particularly if they use terms like feminism, gentrification, have them articulate for themselves what those mean, what those terms mean for them, why they're using them, how they're using them, to really add more richness and understanding to this person's story. Also follow their lead. That's part of the artistry of doing oral history, is that you have your questions and your objectives, but the narrator also has their own objective and things that they want to say, stories they want to share. They know their life better than you do. So maybe follow them down a side path of their history that you didn't think about before. Just see where it goes a little bit. Ask follow-up questions, follow their guide, their lead, not your interview guide as a script. Your questions are there to help you and to keep moving the interview along, but you shouldn't feel like you're tied to that you have to ask every single question and you have to ask every question in the order that you wrote it down in. This is a time for you to explore with the narrator and to go on a journey with them through their memories. Of course, part of this is deep listening and remaining silent. So thinking about really focusing on their stories and what they're sharing, and making sure that you're not sharing too much of yourself, that you don't want to take over the interview and turn it into you talking about your stories and your experiences more than the narrator talks about theirs. That this is really a time for them to have the microphone and share their experiences. And of course, the last question is always the ultimate big open-ended question, that's some variation of, is there anything you wanted to share but didn't? Is there anything you wish I had asked about? Or is there anything else you wanted to add? That just, it's an open question that gives them the floor to say what else is on your mind. Are there any questions before I move on to what happens after the interview? So it looks like there's a question from Daniel. Does the oral history collaborative support documentary style video projects, projects that focus on individual stories, or are these projects specifically for audio only projects? That's a great question. The DC Oral History Collaborative supports both video, sort of documentary style interviewing, and audio documenting or audio recording. And I'll show in a couple examples in the post-interview information. Documentaries are one of the things that have come out of the DC Oral History Collaborative. But there are a couple different grants that you might that might help you in your project. But if you're recording oral histories, it can be video recorded, but the emphasis is on conducting oral history interviews that are video recorded, so that there's that sort of raw material there, rather than maybe some other styles of filmmaking. So that's something that you can definitely have a conversation with Jasper Collier, who's the project or program manager for the DC Oral History Collaborative, and he'll be able to help you work through that a little bit more. But absolutely, the DC Oral History Collaborative is open to that sort of interdisciplinary and experimental approach to oral history. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit of the post-interview process. So you did the interview, everything went great. You stopped the recording, now what? So the first thing is to get the legal release forms or archival donation forms signed. And it's important to do that after the interview, because that is true informed consent. If the narrator is signing it before the interview, they don't know what stories they're going to share. So they don't fully know what they're giving consent to share to an archive or share to the public. So signing it after the interview, make sure that they know exactly what stories they shared, what information they shared, and whether or not they're comfortable donating that to an archive or making it public. And it's important that the narrator keeps a copy of that release form for their own records. Another step is transcribing the interview. So this is a word for word written version of the conversation. You can do this by hand. It takes a long time. It can take an average of 8 hours to transcribe 1 hour of audio recording. There are services that can do this for you. There are also auto-generated transcription services. Either way, you really want to make sure that you listen back and you correct mistakes, and that's called audit editing. So transcribing the interview is one step, but then editing that and checking it is another step, and that's really important. You also want to make sure to give the narrator a copy of the transcript and a copy of the audio file. Sometimes the narrator is not comfortable signing a release form until they're able to review the interview. So it's an ongoing conversation with the narrator after they have reviewed the audio file and review the transcript about when they are comfortable signing the release form. And of course, making sure that they have copies of all of that. At the very minimum, the least they should get out of this experience and out of the time and energy they spent doing this interview with you is a copy of the interview themselves, for themselves. Also, as the interviewer, definitely take notes and reflections on the interview. This is part of how you grow. This is part of how the practice evolves. Is taking those notes, making those comments for yourselves, thinking about what you might do differently in another interview, or what went great that you want to make sure that you do again in the next interviews that you're going to be doing. And then also creating something with it or sharing it with others in different ways. So first, thinking about long-term preservation. And so thinking about, is it going to stay in a personal archive, or are you going to donate it to an archive, or both? If you are keeping it in a personal archive, and particularly for the narrator, helping them make sure that their copy is preserved for a long time. Make multiple copies and have them in multiple locations so that if something happens to one copy, there's a backup. This is especially important if the interview is not going to be donated to an institutional archive, because you need to make sure that these are that having a duplicate copy somewhere else is a backup in case something happens to the original. Of course, physical copies, making sure that it's in a cool, dark, low humidity, stable environment. And with digital copies, making sure that more than one person has access to them. If it requires knowing a password in order to access that digital copy, it doesn't help if only one person knows that password and something happens to that person and no one else can access it. So really thinking about all of these what ifs and having a plan for them. You also want to make sure that you update files and technology regularly. This is something that archives do. And that's just making sure that you can open and play or read the files. It's making sure that you have a working device that's required to play the recording. If the interview is recorded on a mini cassette disc or a mini cassette tape, it's no use if you also don't have a working mini cassette tape player. So really thinking about, as new technology comes out, that you want to update these files and make sure that that they are accessible and that you can continue to play them or read them in terms of the transcript. So how might you use oral histories? Using oral histories and sharing oral histories in different ways is really crucial to the field of oral history and the practice of oral history, because people share their stories and their experiences in ways that they're hoping to get out to multiple people. So here are a few examples from some of the grantees that have worked with the DC Oral History Collaborative. Whitman Walker did a series of interviews that it used for an online exhibit for its 40th anniversary. The Asbury United Methodist Church turned some of their oral history interviews into a series of podcasts. Ola Cultura created a walking tour based on oral histories that they did, and that also at different places allow you to listen to some clips from oral histories. And then the documentary Block, the Brooklyn Literary and Hunting Club, was created using videotaped oral histories plus some additional footage to tell the story of this group of African-American men who created community and shared knowledge and experience and advice across generations while playing poker. So these are different ways that you can use oral history. And of course, there are many more beyond this, but this is just a sampling. For additional resources, The Oral History Association, as I mentioned before, is a great resource. They have additional guides for doing oral history, for archiving oral histories. It's also a great resource for figuring out more to read about oral history, ways to get more involved, also links to different oral history programs and regional oral history organizations and associations. Also, and we'll send you a follow-up email after this with links to these different resources, but Ask Doug is a great resource for choosing digital audio recorders, and Doug Boyd is at the Louis B. Nunn Center at the University of Kentucky in Louisville. And he's created this online portal that helps you choose a digital audio recorder based on your budget and how familiar you are with technology and what you need in terms of the file that is produced. The DC Oral History Collaborative, of course, is a great resource. The DC Public Library Studio Lab at the MLK Library is great for learning about recording and also having recording space available to you. The Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress has some great resources. And the Regional Oral History Association for this area is Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region, which is also a great place for resources. And then Brian Kraft created a DC oral history map based on the survey of oral history collections for interviews related to DC that are based in repositories around DC. And so this is an interactive map where you can explore some of those interviews, see which areas of DC they pertain to, and also figure out where they're located so that you can access them. So any final questions here at the end?
Anna, you do have a few questions in the chat. The first is from Rachel Walls. She should say, speaking of documentaries, how common is it to work alongside historians and the like, and what complications are found while doing so?
So I don't have a ton of experience working with documentaries, but I don't think it's very uncommon to work with historians or scholars. I think that's actually pretty common, especially in the research phase. I think it depends on what kind of documentary you're doing or what the topic is. There are still a lot of debates about the veracity of oral history. And so really thinking about what is the purpose of doing oral histories? Are you just interested in getting some sound bites that conform to the written history, that conform to certain dates, certain names? Or are you interested in stories that maybe throw a little living color in there, that maybe don't stick quite to that same timeline, that may not be hard and fast facts, but really bring it to life and speak to some of the living experiences that people have had from those perspectives or about those events. So I'm not sure it's like a total complication, but there are things to think about. And that's part of the reason why it's important to have members of the community that you'll be interviewing be in that room as you're making decisions and not just relying on these quote unquote professionals or scholars of some of this history. So it looks like another question is, so far it sounds like narrators are usually older folk. If the narrator is quote unquote young, does this become an in-depth interview instead? So it depends. A lot of times we talk about older folks because that's the initial input or impulse rather. that we want to capture their stories and their knowledge before we lose them. But narrators can be young, absolutely. And that can also be in depth. It depends on what you're looking for. If you're interviewing someone who's 14, it may not be as long of an interview because they don't have as much life to talk about as someone who's 90 years old. But that doesn't mean that it's not important, and it doesn't mean that they can't talk in depth about their own experiences and how they understand them. It's just shaped a little bit differently. So there's another question. When we find a significant gap between a narrator's story and a quote unquote official history or master narrative, how can we interpret the gap? That is a super important question. That is a very complicated question that I'm not going to be able to answer for you right now, especially because we only have about 2 minutes left. But that is definitely something that a lot of oral historians have been talking about and thinking about. In that follow-up email that we'll send, there are some suggestions for reading. Alessandro Portelli is one of the leading scholars in oral history, and he has written a lot about that gap between quote unquote official history and the stories that people are telling in oral history, particularly his work on the death of Luigi Trastui. And that again will be in the email that we'll send out as a follow-up. But that's a really important thing that a lot of people are grappling with in oral history. So I really encourage you to look through some of the readings that we suggest, but also the Oral History Reader, which is the journal put out by, the Oral History Review, which is a journal put out by the Oral History Association. And that is a lot of articles about some of this grappling with oral history and how do we handle that gap. How do we think about that gap between oral history and quote unquote official or written history that a lot of different people have different approaches to and different understandings of, but that's a great place to start. So the last question gets us to our very last slides. So some additional ways to follow up. There will be some interviewer training workshops, and these are longer 3-session workshops that really delve into some of these topics, some of these questions. We're in the process of scheduling those, so stay tuned to when those are announced. In addition, this fall, the new grant opportunities will open up. And so these are new projects that collect new oral histories. There are extension grants for people who get some of those new project grants in order to build on those projects that they already started. And all of these create new original oral history interviews that will be archived in the DC Public Library. And you can see some of the projects that have already been completed in the DC Public Library's online Dig DC digital archive, and we'll send you that link as well. And then there are also public projects and events, and that grant allows everyone the opportunity to use existing oral history collections for programming in the public humanities. And then also there's the monthly oral history roundtable discussions. So like a coffee chat with people who are doing oral history. And these are past project directors, narrators, and interviewers. So definitely tune into those to get a little more of the taste of oral history and different people's experiences being involved in oral history projects. And of course, you can find more information on the DC Humanities website, in their programs for the DC Oral History Collaborative. And you can also contact Jasper Collier with any questions, or if you're working on ideas that you want to propose for as a project for one of these grants. So definitely, these are some resources. And thank you. Definitely connect with the DC Oral History Collaborative. And then you can also look up some of my work and some of Maggie's work on our websites. But thank you all for coming. And I hope you've learned a lot. It was a lot of information kind of thrown at you, but definitely keep in touch with Humanities DC to get more involved with the DC Oral History Collaborative.